So without further ado, I have great pleasure in welcoming Hilary Burlock, and she's going to speak about the political aspects of the Georgian Ballroom. So over to you, Hilary.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here and sharing some of my research with you all today. What comes to mind when you think of the assembly rooms of Jane Austen's Britain? Is it the giggling and flirtatious Lydia Bennet or her marriage brokering mamma? Is it the sparking tension between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy at their first meeting? While the assembly rooms of Georgian Britain have been hailed in literature, period dramas, and scholarship as a marriage market, in which young men and women could meet and mingle with the hope of finding a partner in dance and in life, there was a lot more going on in the ballroom. Indeed, many historians see the ballroom as a marriage market without probing the ballroom's deeper potential for forming networks and contributing to the political sphere. The assembly rooms of Great Britain were a space where notions of politeness were upheld, but it was also an inherently political space. The occasions which brought communities together in the assembly rooms were instances of civic pride and ceremony, celebrating the local economy, politics, and judicial system. Elections, assizes, races, and fairs populated the social calendar in the market towns and cities of Great Britain, and the subscription balls at the assembly rooms revolved around these community events. The social season outside of London's parliamentary session took place in the summer and autumn, during the months in which MPs and the nobility visited spas, race meets, country houses, and the seats of their political interests. After the social season in London ended in June, following George III's birthday ball, MPs decamped from the capital to the towns and countryside. Every Lent and summer, the judges of the assizes traveled through the 6 assize circuits. Similarly, the race meetings across Great Britain took place from March to October, but primarily in the summer months to coincide with the summer assizes. Later in the summer and autumn months, the harvest took place and fairs were held in the market towns of Great Britain, aligning fair days with race meetings. So the politicking of the parliamentary session in London from January to June emanated outwards to the assembly rooms of Great Britain during the summer and autumn months, allowing MPs to treat their constituencies for half of the year. Not only did the assembly room's social calendar revolve around these events of civic pride, but they were also spaces for political statements to be made. Some assembly rooms were divided by political faction, with tensions between Whigs and Tories flaring up around the subscription and management of the rooms, and local assembly rooms became scenes of strife based on political alliances. Social and political historians of the 18th century have individually studied elections, horse racing, assizes, and fairs. And typically, dance may only be briefly mentioned in passing, if mentioned at all, without examining in detail the function of these events in the community. My research brings all of these civic events together in this paper to assess the role of dance in creating community cohesion and pride. This approach provides a critical reevaluation of the Georgian period, shifting and intensifying the focus onto dance and its role in local politics. My paper makes use of correspondence, diaries, and memoirs from the period, examining the ways in which local communities came together in celebration or commemoration of national events and politics. The paper opens with an examination of the role of local networks within towns and cities, and the need for political families to connect with the seats of their political interest. Next, I assess the institution of the assembly rooms and its role in civic events, including elections, assizes, races, and fairs, demonstrating that dance was inherently linked with local governance and citizenship. The assembly room was a politically charged arena, with evenings revolving around political and economic events in the social calendar. The ballroom was a space that brought communities together to celebrate local institutions and people. The ballroom, whether in an inn, assembly room, or private residence, was clearly a place of entertainment, as we all know dancing was an enjoyable activity. But enjoyment was not the sole impetus for congregating in this space. The ballroom was also a space where people could see and be seen, where business deals were brokered and networks were forged and strengthened. Local events and rituals played an integral part in reaffirming the networks of dependence and interdependence within towns and counties, confirming the stratified nature of communities while actively engaging them in local and social matters. It should be noted that social strata were not static but permeable, allowing for mobility within social standing, wealth, and degrees of politeness. A gentleman's or lady's efforts to increase his or her connectivity created a web of community relationships, forged through reciprocal ties of obligation and expectation. For the purposes of this paper, I define networks as the complex webs of personal connections formed by each individual with other members of the community, whether based on kinship, friendship, or professional and political interests, and for the purposes of personal benefit or advancement. The ballroom was a space in which these relational networks became flesh, the invisible becoming visible. Balls embodied what Judith Schneid-Lewis described as the network of connections between people, a point of interaction between patrons and clients, tenants and lords. In order to thrive, community networks of dependency, patronage, and political allegiance needed to be established, maintained, and renewed in the ballroom. The social calendar revolved around and became an integral part of local rituals and customs. The social season beyond that enjoyed by the bon ton in London was extremely busy for politicians and their families. Attending balls in the country was a key part of the treating process, demonstrating their engagement with the seat of their political interest. Balls were embedded in social politics, transforming this traditionally perceived feminine sphere into both a locus and means of capitalizing social power. Aristocratic women hosted and attended dinners, balls, and public days to demonstrate the family's grandeur and hospitality, while emphasizing their close ties with boroughs and counties. In 1794, Lady Bessborough wrote that, "My brother, the second Earl Spencer, sent to me to beg I would come here to do the civilities for him, but more to attend a morning ball." The second Earl Spencer consciously chose dance as a part of his community strategy to generate support for his political candidate prior to the election, and involved his sister as hostess to charm the aldermen and their wives. Lady Bessborough emphasized the importance of pleasing the civic elite as a means of strengthening the Spencer family's network and interest in St. Albans. Lady Harriet Elliot, too, was aware of the socio-political value of parties and assemblies, as she wrote to her mother, Lady Chatham, in 1786, "We have had 1,000 invitations for dinners and assemblies, particularly from Lady Salisbury, whose civilities, however, though very well at present, are known the value of. We are to give the world some parties, which I think will have a very good effect." Balls and parties were not solely for socializing and enjoyment, but were part of a larger political strategy. Through a concerted program of dinners, balls, or assemblies, elite hostesses treated their constituencies to good effect and estimated the political value associated with each. Women were central to the process of treating and winning support, and building and maintaining the complex web of interest and patronage. Interacting with members of the community cultivated and maintained the family's political capital while protecting their electoral interests. Indeed, whilst at Seaham in August 1779, Sophia Milbank, sister of Judith Noel Milbank, wrote to her aunt that, "To our great surprise, we found the Milbanks dressed out very fine and going to the assize ball, though they had been 2 nights before at the balls and had danced till 4 in the morning. They have been in a constant hurry for this 3 weeks, with the races and company and the assizes. Ralph Milbank, I find, has some thought of offering himself on the next election." The rounds of balls that peppered the community's social calendar in the summer and autumn kept the local families and their grandees busy. Even without an imminent election looming, political families considered the benefit of cultivating positive relations with the local community, well in advance of announcing the intention to stand as a candidate. Therefore, being present and visible at local events in the country generated goodwill and social credit to be called upon when needed. Indeed, the following year, Judith Noel Milbank herself recounted that the whirlwind of social engagements had finally caught up to her. She said, "My journal scheme has been interrupted by so much business, so many visits, and so much fatigue that it has not been in my power to pursue it. I have sat up 3 nights together till 5 o'clock and danced each evening, which added to the fatigue of dining each day in company. I rejoice we go to Scarborough on Monday, that we may be quiet. To be sure, it is rather a new plan to go to a public place to be quiet, but the eternal visiting in this country is enough to distract one." For those engaged in the political sphere, rounds of visits, balls, and suppers were expected in order to ingratiate oneself with the local populace and gain favor in the weeks and months leading up to a general election. But these were also critical in the intervening years, attending assize, race, and fair balls to maintain favor and goodwill within the community. For political families, either for those who had a family member standing as a member for Parliament, or for those who supported local candidates via patronage, attending balls in the seat of their influence was critical for building and consolidating that interest. Indeed, aristocratic and genteel families felt it was a duty to support local institutions and events in their communities, whether they were truly interested in attending or not. At a festival in Salisbury, the Earl of Malmesbury recounted that he and all the relations attended the festival merely for show. For Harriet Countess Granville, balls in the country were an onerous duty. Attending a ball near Saltram House in Devon in 1823 was all active service, every woman expected to do her duty. Dancing became a tangible means of consolidating and reaffirming social and political networks in Georgian Britain. Balls afforded opportunities for making introductions, renewing acquaintances, and maintaining pivotal social, business, and political contacts, rendering this sphere a focal point for social navigation. A key part of their role required aristocratic families to attend country meetings when not residing in London, wherein they would be cheered and drawn and huzzaed by the local constituents, eager to be in the presence and gain the notice of their patrons. There was a seasonality to the subscription ball season, which local grandees sought to attend when they left London. Therefore, seasonality of the politic constituencies here. Embraced active involvement in electoral politics were particularly cognizant of the effective use to which balls could be employed in crafting their families' personas and managing their social power. Elite families carefully choreographed the appearances they made, both in fashionable society and the counties of their political interests. Canvassing and treating was a continuous cycle, extending beyond the confines of nomination and polling. In the months prior to an election, the social calendar was dotted with election dinners, speeches on the hustings, parades, and balls. Voters were cognizant of their social and political power and influence, and bargained for patronage, favors, and entertainments by which they could be swayed. Balls fit into the boisterous and bustling sphere of electoral politics, providing an arena for more refined political discourse within the campaign. The timing of an election ball and its intended political impact were correlated, as balls held before elections were orchestrated to maintain an elite family's influence over their electoral interest. In September 1773, Lady Chatham wrote to her nephew's wife, Anne Pitt, of her surprise to hear of Mr. Pitt dancing, hoping that the ladies were duly sensible of their obligation on the occasion, and that it will be remembered at a proper time. For I assure you, it is only an innocent election that they are wished to contribute to. The honor of dancing with Mr. Pitt formed an unspoken obligation leading up to the 1774 election. However, if a candidate refused to dance with key members of society, there would be consequences. One Mrs. Bedingfield attended the assize balls near Norwich in 1726, exclaiming, "How the representative of the county can answer not dancing with the high sheriff's lady and a pretty woman, the next election will show." Balls held during the electoral campaign wooed voters and earned political credit as part of the treating process. Although referenced in literature, Sir Hyacinth O'Brien, in Maria Edgeworth's novel Rosanna, utilized dance as a canvassing tool, inviting the Grey family to attend his election ball. The invitation was followed up by a visit from the candidate to assess the family's support, though the Greys were not swayed by the honor of the invitation to bestow their votes. Another attempt to win over the constituency represented in Charles Anstey's 1776 poem, An Election Ball. Mr. Inkle conversed with the candidate, who revealed, "I am promised, my lord, by old Humphrey Potwobbler, the votes of 3 tailors, 2 smiths, and a cobbler." This indicates an unofficial method of canvassing where the candidate determined whose votes he had secured and whose support he still needed to gain during the ball. Election balls were one of the political tools used to court constituents, whether staunch supporters or undecided. Post-election balls celebrated the prevailing candidates and expressed their gratitude. In Catherine Gore's 1836 novel, Mrs. Armitage, or Female Domination, the novel recounts the common custom and timing for the crowning honors of the ball to take place immediately after the election, for the member to express appreciation for the community's support. This was an opportunity for his staunchest supporters to congregate and celebrate their political beliefs in solidarity. Regardless of whether a first-time election or a subsequent return to Westminster, convention obliged the MP to host an election ball. Despite having returned without opposition in Liverpool in 1774, Sir William Meredith and Richard Pennant nonetheless held a ball. Similarly, James Oakes, a yarn merchant and prominent citizen of Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, recounted that following the unopposed election of Lord Charles Fitzroy and Sir Charles Davers in June 1790, a dinner and ball were held at the Angel. The Duke of Grafton dined with us and about 24 other gentlemen, in all about 50. In the evening, a very full ball at the new Assembly House, about 70 couple of dancers, the number present about 400. The apparently unnecessary expense of holding a ball in an unopposed election may be reframed as a political investment, renewing, consolidating, and maintaining that support for future elections. Election balls were complex social events which helped to reinforce a sense of civic identity and citizenship. Elections were not solely decided by policy or local issues, but also by the candidates' personalities and their ability to engender strong bonds with the community, bonds which could not casually be inherited. While balls were an integral component of the ritualized nature of electoral politics, they were also a significant part of the ceremony of the assizes. Every Lent and summer, the justices of assize traveled through the 6 assize circuits, including the Home, Midland, Norfolk, Northern, Oxford, and Western circuits. They were commissioned to hear and determine, or oyez and terminer in law French, the more serious cases of treason and felony sent to it from the quarter sessions, to set up the local court and call for jurors to preside. According to one Mr. Bellamy, who attended the assizes for 62 years, he remembered that in every county on this circuit, there was an assize ball on the commission day of each assize. This ball was attended by the nobility and gentry of the county and the judges and bar. The judges used to wear to the balls the black silk gown, band, and the 2-curl bob wig. They were attended by the high sheriff wearing a full court dress, bag wig, and sword, and his chaplain in his gown, cassock, and band. The judges did not dance, but they usually played at whist. The assize ball was expected as part of the ritual following the entry of the circuit judges into the town on commission day, or the day in which the commission of oyez and terminer was opened, and sometimes after the assizes themselves. Inhabitants of the town met the justice of the assize in his carriage at the town gates, and followed him through the streets to the location where the trials were to be held. Holding an assize ball was a long-standing tradition, perhaps dating to the early 18th century, as the diary of Abigail Gawthorne of Nottingham recounted in March 1800 that there was no assembly, to the shock of the town, as it has not been omitted of 100 years. Making specific note of a lack of a ball, contravening the long-standing custom, indicated how central this social event was to the community. 3 years later, in 1803, there's evidence that this situation had been rectified, with an assize ball taking place in the assembly rooms. Genteel families frequently attended the local assizes as a social event, and a place to keep up to date on the current news of the town. Mrs. Harris's letter to her son in Berlin in 1776 recounted the assizes in Salisbury, demonstrating a strange blend of the excitement of attending the ball, in which one great prize for the ladies was the High Sheriff himself, before seamlessly moving on to discuss the business of the assizes, in which Miss Mary Bowes had her sister Diana Bowes forcibly carried to a madhouse at Mitford in April last for theft. That assize ball became a scene of excitement because Mr. Northey, the High Sheriff, chose to dance with the ladies rather than observe or play cards. However, some were uncomfortable with hosting a ball at the same time as the assizes, not because of the callous contrast between jollity and anguish. Rather, as John Cooper, an attorney from Salisbury, observed in 1764, that the judges, out of 15 cases, left 6 untried. Scandalous to go to the assembly and neglect business they are so well paid for. Cooper viewed the assembly as a distraction from the duty the judges were to execute on the assize circuits. However, by the 1840s, the ritual of the assize ball was declining, as Sir George Crewe campaigned against this cruel and unchristian custom by publishing a letter in the county newspapers, showing how cruel and heartless it appeared that any person should be found engaged in worldly mirth and amusement on so solemn an occasion, when so many poor creatures were trembling on the eve of their trial, perhaps for their lives. The assize ball of the 18th century was therefore an uncomfortable paradox. They were events which brought people together around the execution of jurisprudence, but became social occasions in which genteel families gathered to enjoy each other's company. The entertainment was juxtaposed with the anxiety of the prisoners whose cases were to be heard in the course of the assizes, with imprisonment, execution, and other punishments looming. The summer assize circuits also frequently overlapped with race season and the slew of balls that accompanied those equestrian events. Crucially, Oliver Cox's recent research on the politicized nature of the races at Newmarket sheds new light on the implications of attending race balls. While races were held all around the country in August, the race week at Newmarket captured the popular and political imagination in the 18th century and in the present. Oliver Cox noted that the racecourse was transformed into an extra-parliamentary space, further arguing that racing was an essential part of the structure of politics by the middle of the 18th century, and was understood as such by contemporaries. However, unlike other race weeks around Great Britain, Newmarket was unusual in that it did not develop the addition of assembly rooms to their race meetings. Most race meetings comprised a week of attending the races alongside rounds of dinners and balls. These races had a further politicized connection in that prospective and current MPs frequently attended these gatherings and subsidized the prizes. The meeting of those with an interest in horseflesh and equine sport was only one draw for attending the races, as Edmund Burke attended not for the sport in and of itself, but it was thought the pulse of the country would be felt there. Race weeks were a time to forge and reaffirm networks in the country and to catch up on news, political or otherwise, on the field, around the dinner table, and in the ballroom. Indeed, Sophia Millbank, whilst staying in Kedleston in Derbyshire in August 1780, exclaimed that the assizes and races were very great meetings, and we were received with particular attention. I went to the assize ball with Miss Fitzherbert. Mr. Burgess danced with her, and I opened the ball in a minuet. The first night of the race, I had the honour of joining the Duchess of Devonshire, who came from Portsmouth on purpose to be at the race, and all the family was there, and many other families from different parts, and entirely all the Derbyshire people. Indeed, it was a very brilliant meeting. For Sophia Millbank, the races at Kedleston were an opportunity for display, in opening the ball with a minuet, and for distinction, in being invited to join the 5th Duchess of Devonshire's party. The nobility and gentry viewed these events as an opportunity to continue the treating process. Countess Granville wrote to her sister, Lady Georgiana Morpeth, in 1811, that I have been at the Stafford races, betting and courting all the people at a great rate. For the inhabitants of the towns, this was a period in the year in which they could expect the attentions of their local grandees, and flocked to races, dinners, and balls for similar opportunities to network, to gain the ear of their MPs, and to seek favours and patronage. Another event which brought local communities together in the ballroom was the annual fair in market towns. The fairs featured livestock sales, as well as the wholesale and retail buying and selling of goods. Jessica Davidson's research illuminates that most of the population of Great Britain lived within a few miles of a fair, and were visited by local inhabitants and visitors from further afield for the purpose of buying and selling and the entertainments the fairs provided. James Oakes, a yarn merchant, scrupulously attended the fair balls in Bury. This was an event which attracted most inhabitants. In October 1794, Oakes attended the second fair assembly held that season, and remarked that it was remarkably full and very splendid. Among the 400 guests were none other than the Duchess of Grafton and her 3 lady daughters, Duchess of Chandos, Marquis Cornwallis, etc., etc., etc. James Oakes attended the fair ball at the end of each day of buying and selling, and recorded who was there and how many dancers participated each evening. In October 1809, Oakes similarly recounted in his journal that the 13th of that month was an extreme full fair day of the best company, many of whom turned out for the ball that evening. The fair balls in Bury operated as an integral part of the subscription ball season, operated from their local assembly rooms in celebration of commerce and the local economy. The slew of assize, race, and fair balls also had another critical purpose in supporting local manufactories. Textile mills were often the target of local support. In the south of England in 1801, Mrs. Philip Libb Powys, whilst in Canterbury for Race Week, attended the ball on the evening of the 27th of August, where she noted, "The ladies mostly dressed in silver Canterbury muslins, all manufactured by Callaway in this city. I think one hardly ever saw so many pretty women, Lady Darnley one of the most beautiful. Lord Camden danced the whole evening with Lady Darnley, and vastly well indeed did both perform." Not only was this race ball a chance for the local elite to demonstrate their allegiance to the community, but it was also an opportunity and an arena for allegiance of another sort. In wearing silver Canterbury muslins, the ladies of the town invested in their local economy and industry, in supporting Callaway's manufactory in the production of this fabric. In 1785, Lincoln started to host Lincolnshire colour or stuff balls in the county assembly rooms for the encouragement of the stuff manufactures and the consumption of the great staple produce of the county, long wool. Each ball attendee was required to wear an outfit made from the locally produced stuffs, or woolen textiles made in the local Lincolnshire manufactories and using the long wool native to the area. The Lincolnshire Stuff Ball was organized to procure employment of the infant poor, with impoverished workers employed in the manufactories, while also supporting local businesses which had been in decline in recent years. The early balls in the 1780s were held at the Windmill Inn in Alford, before moving to the assembly rooms in Lincoln in 1789. The stuff ball was an event which drew the notice and attendance of the nobility and gentry of the county, 466 ladies and gentlemen in total. In October 1790, the stuff ball was held at the local assembly room, with Lady Monson presiding as patroness, and the Earl of Exeter and Sir Peter Burrell acting as ball stewards. The Stamford Mercury outlined the specific rules to be followed when attending these balls, as ladies were admitted gratis on their appearance in a stuff gown and petticoat of the colour appointed by the patroness, spun, woven, and finished within the county, and producing a ticket signed by the weaver and countersigned by James Ibbotson Dyer at Louth. Tickets will be delivered with every 12 yards of stuff. Gentlemen paid 10 shillings and sixpence and were similarly required to wear a coat, waistcoat, and breeches of stuff that complied with the colour scheme, as silk and cotton were banned from being worn. With each annual ball, a new colour of stuff was selected to ensure that new garments were worn by all the ladies and gentlemen attending. In 1786, Richard Lucas, a cloth merchant, announced that he had appropriate stuff for the Isabella-coloured gown and petticoats for the ball that year. Isabella is a greyish-yellow or light buff colour. 4 years later, in 1790, Lady Monson selected carmelite, or a dark brown, for that year's colour. The customary fee for attending a ball at the assembly rooms was waived for the ladies, though not for the gentlemen, such that money was spent in the local weavers' and dyers' shops. The Lincolnshire Stuff Ball lasted from 1785 all the way through to the 1920s, as a newspaper article in the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer from 1938 reported that, after a lapse of 10 years, Lady Brownlow sought to reinstate the tradition. These balls not only supported local and national politicking, but also bolstered local economies. While the assembly rooms helped to bring the local community together in celebration of political, judicial, and economic systems, they also became scenes of strife. Assembly rooms became political battlegrounds where divisions between Tory and Whig, or government and opposition, manifested. In Grantham's assembly rooms in Lincolnshire in 1737, subscribers included Whig grandees like the Duke of Rutland and the Earl of Exeter, as well as numerous Whiggish MPs and members of the community. Whigs dominated the subscription books in Grantham to the extent that Tories were systematically excluded. Similarly, York's assembly rooms in the 1730s were also the backdrop to contentious political divisions, as Whigs controlled the management of the rooms by balloting for directors to assert their political power over the Tory subscribers. The board of directors, like Grantham, saw the 3rd Earl of Buckingham, 3rd Earl of Burlington, the 2nd Marquess of Rockingham, and the 5th Duke of Devonshire, key leaders of Whiggish opposition, managed the assembly rooms in York. The divisions between Whig and Tory became so heated that they met at separate assemblies, with Thursdays reserved for the governing Whigs and Mondays for the Tories in the early decades of the 18th century. Both assemblies contributed financially to fund the rooms in Blake Street, designed by one of their directors, the 3rd Earl of Burlington. And the space seems to have been physically divided, demarcating the spaces used by either party, with Tory ladies donating £50 for furnishing the small ballroom. In Lincoln's assembly rooms, the ballroom floor was divided by party, with each staking their claim on either side of the ballroom. The assembly rooms became a battleground on which skirmishes between Whigs and Tories manifested and played out at the local level, well beyond the Palace of Westminster. The assembly rooms were a vital institution in Georgian Britain, situated at the heart of towns and cities the length and breadth of the country. The symbiotic relationship between politics and dance supported the development of civic identity and citizenship, supporting local and national politics and the emergence of polite and commercialized leisure. The ballroom was also an important arena for intensive political discussion, in signifying networks and allegiances and allowing for diverse forms of political expression. The occasions which brought subscribers together in the ballroom were steeped in politics and economics, revolving around the process of treating before and during elections, as well as the assizes, race meetings, and fairs. Balls in the assembly rooms therefore celebrated political people and institutions, the judicial system, and the local economy. In analyzing Georgian social dance in this way, we can assess prints like this one in a new light, in which the implications of attending and dancing at a ball had much higher stakes. With dance as a common language, balls brought together different strata of society around issues that were found at the heart of the local community. The Georgian ballroom was consequently not only a marriage market, but an intensely political arena. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hilary. That was an absolutely fascinating talk, and you've really given us a real depth and understanding of political and economic background to attending balls at the period. A question that I've got actually, what comes next after you finish your research, Hilary? Can you give us some idea? What's the
Absolutely. I'm actually in the 3rd year of my PhD at Queen Mary University of London. So I'm currently in the process of finishing up my research, writing and editing the final thesis to be submitted hopefully in the autumn, as long as everything goes according to plan. And then after that, I will hopefully be able to find a postdoc position, but also be able to work on publishing my thesis as a book with a publisher. I also have a couple of articles with academic journals that I have submitted, and hopefully those will be coming out in the next year or so.
Oh, we certainly look forward to seeing those publications, Hilary. Yes, we've got several questions coming in. I knew we'd have a lot of questions and comments. Andrea Davis, she asks, was there any evidence of actual fights breaking out between political factions?
Well, it depends. So in terms of physical fights, not that I've come across, although I'm sure that there are anecdotes out there just waiting to be discovered. But in terms of tensions between Whigs and Tories, certainly that was the case in London during the social season. For example, there was tension between the outgoing government and the new government in London at one of the balls of Mrs. Anne Pitt in Knightsbridge. And there was an intermediary that was required to bring the two sides back together because they refused to interact and mingle in Mrs. Anne Pitt's home. So there were not physical fights, but there were certainly political tensions and spurning or rebuffing.
Right.
It's all about reading the room in that way.
Yes. So I've got a question from Jennifer Staples. Generally speaking, she says, did your research show how many people would attend the most politically important balls?
It depended on the size and space of the assembly rooms, but certainly it's not uncommon to see 300, 400, 500 people at the assembly rooms. So there were 466 at that Lincolnshire Stuff Ball in Lincoln, and 400 is certainly common at Bath's assembly rooms, as well as Bury St. Edmunds. So hundreds of people, although not everyone is going to be dancing. James Oakes recounted that there were 70 couples of dancers for that one ball. So you've got 140 people dancing, but you've got everyone else mingling on the sidelines, playing cards. It's all about that social interaction on the dance floor, but also around it.
We've got a question from Annette Courtney, and she's asking, what would happen if a guest offended the hostess somehow?
Usually, well, I believe it would be usual for tensions to be addressed afterwards if this is a private ball. If you're in the assembly rooms, those rooms are managed by the Master of Ceremonies, and it would be his responsibility to create tension between, so for example, one lady, it's her turn to lead off the country dance and to determine the tune and call the figures, and another woman was also claiming that it was her turn. It would be up to the Master of Ceremonies to say, all right, let's step out into the hallway and see if we can resolve this.
And Allegra has asked, can you just enlarge on how charity was perceived in the era? And she says, I know contemporary ideas of charity have changed.
Absolutely. Certainly, elite patrons were very involved in charities, and there were charity balls for assisting the poor, assisting people who were sometimes in the poorhouse, or they would designate a specific charity to raise funds for them during the period. So charity was definitely also at the heart of holding balls in these communities.
Thank you. And a question from Kieran Williams. He says, or she says, You mentioned how fashion choices at the balls for both men and women often were prescribed to support local economies, financially or symbolically. And the question is, to what extent did this differ in extremity between men and women?
I think women were probably the most likely to participate in politicized fashion because there's such a range of textiles. You've got the silver Canterbury muslins, you've got the requirement of the local stuffs, which was for both men and women. But usually it's the women who are making the political statements with their fans, with headdresses or adornments on their gowns or in their hair. For example, in the recovery balls for George III in 1789, after he recovered from illness, there are loads of newspaper reports which talk about the accessories women donned. So there were headdresses that said, "God save the king," certain numbers of feathers that you wore in your hair that became politicized, the number that you actually wore. But certainly men were also engaged in political dressing. Certainly I've come across an event where I believe it was a wig ball and everyone showed up dressed in blue, so wearing party colors.
And the next one actually goes on from that in a way, from Bill Card. He's asking, can you remind me of the general constituencies represented by the Whigs and the Tories?
Ooh, that's a really, really large question. So it definitely depends on area, but Lady Spencer and her family, they were situated around St. Albans. The Duchess of Devonshire, of course, would be up in Derbyshire around Chatsworth, but she was also a patroness for the Cook family over in Norfolk. So there's this network connecting a lot of these elite families together. They're supporting candidates in their own seats of interest, but they're also supporting candidates in other locations as well. That's a massive question, and it would be fantastic to visually map what the different constituencies looked like across the entirety of Great Britain. That's a fantastic question.
And Elena's asking, is it possible to trace any political significance in the choice of the dances at the assemblies?
Yes, yes it is. So what I've found over the course of my research is that there are politicized tunes. Now, we all know that there are dance manuals and dance publications where there are sets of tunes and figures published each year in sets of 12, sets of 24. But it's important to note that the tunes and the figures were not firmly linked. You could select any tune and set whichever figures you liked at the ball if you had a chance to call that. And tunes were recognized as having political affiliations. So I believe in the 1830s, an election ball in which the Tory candidate prevailed, they opened the ball with the tune "Hurrah for the Bonnets of Blue." And so these tunes were read in the similar way as the ballroom as being politically charged as well. Great question.
I think this question actually leads on from there, in fact. A question from Susan. She said, I saw you had a dance slide, the Whigs of Fife. And I'm interested to hear if there are any assize balls in Scotland.
Oh, that's a very good question. I haven't come across any in the course of my research, but I'm certainly interested in looking into that further, especially to see how judicial systems were similar or different between England and Scotland, especially. That's a great question, and I will definitely look into that more. Thank you, Susan.
And then a question from Jane, who I assume is in the States. She says, although balls fell out of favour eventually, I think I can see some echoes in the US in the way they host balls for political campaigning. What do you think? She says.
Well, it's certainly interesting to see how long politicized balls lasted. So certainly the tone changes over the course of the 19th century. And there's a greater awareness that one is trying not to overtly win people over with entertainments. And so they're trying to get away from overt bribery over the 19th century. And certainly by, I think, the early years of the 20th century, the election ball is no longer held. But it's interesting to see how inauguration balls continued on from 1809, I believe, with Madison, all the way up to, well, it would have been tonight, but I believe they're doing virtual events instead because of the pandemic. But it's interesting to see how the inauguration ball is very tied to that tradition of the election ball, where you're celebrating and coming together after the electoral campaign.
It's interesting how there's a continuity.
And very timely for today.
Absolutely, yes, definitely that. So Jill Strobridge has got a question. Was there a similar political element in the country house balls, or were these simply a more social engagement?
There was definitely a meeting of networks within country house balls. So the networks are coming together and they're all dancing together. But also there are public days, for example, and the Duchess of Devonshire held several public days at Chatsworth House, where the tenants and the local community gathered together at the Assembly House, at the country house. So it depends on your audience. You might have the meeting of elite families, but you might also have the meeting of the patrons and their tenants. And certainly during election balls, there are some instances where multiple election balls are held. Sometimes where all of the genteel families are specifically invited to one, and then the farmers and tenants invited to another. So there are different audiences, but again, all of this politicking is taking place in urban centers, but also at the country house.
And our next question from Helen Loring Jensen is about the clothes. And she says, what sorts of local textiles are being turned into ladies' ball dresses in Lincolnshire? And do we have any surviving pictures?
Sadly, I haven't come across any images, but I've come across different textiles being produced in different areas. So the Canterbury muslins for those race balls, woolen textiles, although it doesn't actually give any specifics for Lincoln, but also in Norwich, they had their own textile balls to support that local industry. And I believe those textiles were made to imitate silk satin, yes, if I'm recalling correctly.
And Darren and Abby Malins, and I'll echo this too, because I'm actually originally a Lincolnshire person. They say, thank you, it's so interesting, I learned so much. It was nice to hear about Lincoln, my birthplace. Did you actually visit Lincoln and Bury as part of your research?
I have been to Bury St Edmunds, yes. Sadly, I haven't made it to Lincoln yet. I was going to be traveling to quite a few assembly rooms as part of my research, but that was curtailed because of the pandemic. So hopefully those visits will be continuing in the coming years as soon as it is safe to do so.
Lovely, you've got a treat when you go to Lincoln.
I'm looking forward to it.
And Jeff Main, I think this is actually one which I need to answer. I see you are recording tonight. Will this talk be available? Yes, the answer is definitely yes. It will be available on the Historical Dance Society's YouTube channel after the talk. Not immediately after the talk, but certainly within the next few days. So look out for that, please. And then we've got a Jane Austen question from Geraldine Buchanan. And she says, in Jane Austen's novels, the balls mentions do not seem to involve politics, just opportunities for meeting a marriage partner or moving the plot along. Are there nuances of politics in them?
In Jane Austen's novels, it's not necessarily stated in an explicit way, but certainly when one looks at the subscription ball season, they're usually based around these more political or economic events. So even though it's not mentioned, it's probably fairly likely that there's some event that is being marked through holding balls at the assembly rooms. Certainly in terms of her correspondence, I know I've come across her and her family members attending balls all across England. Oh gosh, Eliza de Feuillide specifically knew that it was the place to meet people. So if you were visiting a town, for example, and you needed to know who the different key families were, you would go to the assembly rooms. I believe, oh, no, I don't remember the name of that place, but they specifically didn't have assembly rooms, and she was feeling the lack of it because she wasn't able to meet and mingle with the key families in that area.
And in fact, another Jane Austen, well, sort of Jane Austen question. Andrea Davis says, in Jane Austen novels, there's often refreshments at balls. What form would this take? And were the refreshments including in the price of admission?
Yes. So if you were a subscriber to the assembly rooms, that often covered tea, coffee, and refreshments. So you might have little rout cakes, you would have ratafia, you'd have punch, tea and coffee, light refreshments like that. And frequently over the course of the evening, you would have dancing beginning at 7 or 8 o'clock. You would have a tea room, usually as part of the assembly room premises. So you could go into the tea room for refreshments throughout the evening. And sometimes with the more formal balls, there were breaks in the dancing so that everyone was sitting down to a ball supper before resuming and continuing to dance. Usually assembly room balls ended around midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes later if they were private balls.
And a question on assembly rooms again from Bill Card. He's asking, what other purposes did the assembly rooms serve when there wasn't a ball? Were they town meetings, bazaars, rented for private functions?
Absolutely. So charity meetings could take place in assembly rooms. They were spaces for concerts, card parties, ridottos, which are sometimes masked gatherings. So there were a range of different activities that could take place within this space. The early definitions of assembly rooms mainly talk about it as a general meeting place. But over the course of the 18th century, those definitions shift to really focus the attention on dancing. Not to say that other events didn't take place, because they certainly did, but the main focus was on dance. Great question.
Thank you. And Derek Schofield, I see we're just at 8 o'clock, but we've only got a couple more questions. So much of the evidence you presented is from provinces. Was there any difference in the balls held in London, particularly during the parliamentary settings? And were the London balls used for political purposes?
The very, very short answer is yes, but I'm going to expand. So certainly during the London season, there were a slew of balls that accompanied the social season. And the social season really revolved around the sitting of Parliament. The season opened with Queen Charlotte's birthday ball in January and closed after George III's in June. And during that time, there are a slew of balls, assemblies, routs, card parties, suppers, a massive range of entertainments. And a lot of these events were to do with winning over supporters to party. So they could actually win supporters to cast their votes and aye or nay in Parliament, but also to really consolidate those networks in London. So they could be used to win supporters to a cause. They could also be used to indicate divisions. So depending on who was invited, what was danced, the tensions between George III and his son, the Prince of Wales, who are Tory and Whig, to use those terms, those tensions between members of the royal family became really apparent and politicized. So depending on whether you were a member of the government or a member of the opposition, you're hosting balls to win supporters and to try to draw supporters away from the other side. Really fascinating. It's a chapter in my thesis.
I think actually we're going to have to draw it to a close now. Just one quick question from Bill Card. He's asking about the Duchess of Devonshire. Was that Georgiana Cavendish, a predecessor or a successor? He's asking.
It was Georgiana Cavendish, the 5th Duchess of Devonshire. She's rather an iconic figure in the period. Everyone loves to study her because she had this charisma and charm, and she just drew people to her. So yes, she was a critical figure in this political scene. And she was very involved in the 1784 Westminster election. But because quite a lot of the reception of her involvement in that campaign got so out of hand in the press, she was rather disappointed not to be able to continue in general elections after that.
Thank you. Well, we've got lots of comments too about what a marvellous talk it was and a fascinating talk. Clearly you've done a lot of research.
If anyone has any further questions, please do feel able to reach out to me on Twitter or on Facebook. I'm always happy to answer questions.
That's lovely. And I mean, I'll echo that too. I mean, it's been an absolutely fascinating evening. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
And as I said before, this lecture will be available on the Historical Dance Society's YouTube channel. And just a plug for our next lecture, which will be in February. And the theme the next time is the English dancing master, and Anne Hinchliffe will be giving the talk at that particular day. So that'll be on the 17th of February, Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So thank you very much again, Hilary, and I'll draw the proceedings to a close.
Thank you so much.